I once saw my husband carry his suitcase out of the kitchen, leaving behind the cries of our child and the shattered wedding photo on the floor. The man I had loved the most turned his back on me and said straight to my face, "You've never once made me proud." I thought my life ended there, but I went hungry to buy milk for my child, sewed through the nights to survive, and then rose from the ruins. Years later, I met him again at a lavish party where he once believed himself the victor. But that night, the whole hall saw the truth, and he was the one left humiliated. I learned that revenge is not true victory. Keeping your family together is the ultimate triumph. Asterisk. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be so happy to connect with you. I am 65 years old now, but there are wounds that never truly heal, lying dormant like old scars and sometimes throbbing as if it were only yesterday. The deepest wound of my life was when I had just turned 29. That was the year I learned that love is not enough to keep a man who has already turned his back, and that a young wife's tears cannot stitch together a marriage already torn apart. Daniel, my husband back then, was once the kind of man everyone admired. Tall, ambitious, eloquent. I thought myself lucky to have married him, but after the wedding, the gaps between us grew wider. Daniel was rarely home, and when he was, he brought only a weary, bored look with him. I told myself he must be busy with work, and I tried to shoulder everything else. The meals, the house, the child. I believed that one day he would recognize the value of the little things I did for our family. That day never came. I remember that fateful afternoon clearly. In the kitchen, thick with the smell of fried onions, I was stirring porridge for Sophia, our 1-year-old daughter. She sat in her crib, a tiny hand sucking on her thumb, her dark eyes like to innocent beads. I bent down and whispered, "Good girl, mommy's almost done." Suddenly, the kitchen door opened. Daniel stood there, his face expressionless, his eyes rehearsed for this very moment. My heart clenched, a bad premonition rushed in. "Liz," he said, his voice dry, "I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore." I froze. The spoon slipped from my hand and clattered onto the tile. I turned to him, stunned. What are you saying? Leaving where? What do you mean?" Daniel didn't hesitate, as if he had prepared a speech. "Angela gives me what you never could. She makes me proud. And you." His gaze dropped to my flour-dusted hands, his chin lifting in disdain. "You've never once made me proud. All your life is just circling this kitchen with that crying baby." His words cut through me like a blade. Sophia suddenly burst into tears, her wails echoing off the stained walls, tearing through the air. I reached for her, but Daniel stepped closer, his voice rising. "Don't blame me, Liz. I'm just choosing the life I want, and that life doesn't have you in it." I choked back sobs, struggling to speak. "And what about Sophia? She's your daughter." Daniel shrugged, cold and careless. "I'll send money. That's enough. The rest is up to you." In that moment, I felt myself plummet into a void. The man I had loved and trusted had become a stranger. I watched him bend down to pick up his suitcase, a suitcase that had clearly been packed beforehand. It was as if he had been waiting for this very second to walk out on us. I still hoped, in that final second, that Daniel would glance back at the baby screaming red-faced. But he didn't. He walked straight out, slamming the door behind him. And at that very moment, the wedding photo on the wall fell. The shattering of glass rang sharp through the kitchen, shards scattering at my feet. I clutched Sophia to my chest, tears spilling over, and understood that my marriage had turned to ashes. Sophia wailed in her crib, her cries high and piercing, tearing apart the tiny kitchen. She didn't understand what was happening, only that her mother was trembling, eyes blurred with tears, and the man who should have protected her was walking away without looking back once. I collapsed to my knees beside the crib, my hands trembling as I scooped her up. The smell of milk mixed with the bitter salt of my sweat. I patted her back, murmuring words of comfort I barely believed myself. "It's all right, my love. Mommy's here. Mommy's here with you." The door slammed shut, heavy as a lock sealing me inside an invisible prison. Daniel was gone for real. No apology, no trace of pity. He carried off my youth and the trust I had placed in him, leaving behind a young wife and a baby barely a year old. I heard the dragging of his suitcase fade down the hall, then silence. Silence fell like a curtain, broken only by Sophia's cries and my stifled sobs. My heart felt crushed, at once aching and enraged. I hadn't just lost a husband. I had lost the illusion that love could save everything. I leaned back against the stained wall, my eyes blurred with tears. In my mind's eye, I saw Daniel hand in hand with Angela, striding boldly forward, while Sophia and I were nothing but cast-offs at the roadside. I bit my lip until the taste of blood filled my mouth, holding back any further screams. I didn't want to scare Sophia more, but she kept crying, her fragile sobs cutting straight to the bone. I looked down at her. Her tiny fingers clutched mine, as if begging me not to abandon her. That touch, light as a feather, jolted me awake. I realized I no longer had the right to collapse. One thought echoed in my head. For her, I have to stand up. I wiped my tears, drew a long breath, and held Sophia close. Outside, the lonely dusk poured through the window, bathing the kitchen in a withered gold. And then, as if to snuff out the last glimmer of light, the wedding photo fell again. The sound of glass shattering was sharp, cold, merciless. The fragments scattered across the tile, reflecting a warped image of me holding my child. In that moment, I knew my marriage was over, beyond saving. I closed my eyes, tears still streaming, and whispered into my daughter's fine hair, "You are the only reason I have to keep living, and I promise, I will never let you grow up without love." The first storm of my life had swept everything away, but from its wreckage, I lit a vow that would follow me for the rest of my days. After the day Daniel left, I had no choice but to move out of the old house. Every corner of every wall, every broken tile where our wedding photo had once hung made it hard to breathe. One rented a small apartment in a working-class district, its walls mottled with mold, the ceiling sometimes dripping rainwater. No one dreams of living in a place like that, but to me then, it was an entire world of safety to shelter Sophia. By day, I left my daughter with a kind neighbor and worked at a small tailoring shop. My hands swelled and reddened from needles, my eyes strained from hours of staring at fabric. Sometimes I had to hold my breath to keep from crying when I heard the younger women chattering about their husbands and children, while all I had was my own cold shadow. At night, I held Sophia close, breathing in the scent of her tender skin. There were nights when my purse held only a few coins. I would place a small loaf of bread on the table, look at it, and decide to save it. I drank water for dinner, and with the little money I had, I bought milk for Sophia, watching her drink until she was full, her eyes slowly closing. My stomach ached with hunger, but my heart felt a small warmth. Many nights I sat quietly in the dim room, the yellow light falling on the rickety wooden table. Sophia slept soundly, breathing steadily under an old blanket. I refused to let time drift by in despair. Instead, I pulled from a cardboard box the discarded books and magazines people had thrown away. There were crumpled fashion magazines and an old, yellowed book on sewing techniques. I read until my eyes burned, scribbling notes on scraps of paper. Each turned page whispered a promise. "Liz, you can be different. Just don't give up." I remember once the shop owner glanced at me as I stayed late after work, practicing how to straighten stitches on a scrap of fabric. She smirked. "Planning to become a designer? Around here, people just need straight seams. No one cares about fancy stuff." I lowered my head and said nothing. But inside me, a slow burning fire had begun. I didn't want to drift through life like this forever. I wanted Sophia to grow up knowing her mother fought, not surrendered. Every stitch I sewed, every page I read at night, was a small step in the journey of saving myself. Sometimes I felt so exhausted I thought I would collapse. But then I would glance at the bed and see Sophia reaching out in her sleep as if searching for me. And I would whisper to myself, "You can't be weak. You can't." One sweltering morning, while I was bent over my work in the tailor shop, a customer came in. She handed me a piece of blue fabric and asked me to fix a half-finished dress. I measured each seam carefully, adjusting every stitch as if it were the most precious thing in the world. When she returned to pick up the dress, her eyes lit up, and a true smile appeared on her lips. "You sew beautifully. Every seam is smooth, as if woven by a skilled craftswoman. You have talent, don't waste it." That sentence was like a faint beam of light piercing the darkness around me. How long had it been since anyone had praised me, since I'd heard a single word of recognition? My heart trembled, my eyes stung. That simple compliment became a spark, reminding me I was not just an abandoned woman, I still had worth. But that fragile light hadn't spread far before the old shadows returned. One afternoon, as I carried Sophia back home, the door to our tiny apartment swung open. Daniel stood there, the same expensive suit, the same scent of costly cologne, only his eyes were stranger, more condescending than ever. He didn't ask about his daughter, didn't even look at me. He simply pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and tossed it onto the rickety wooden table. "Take it and get by. Consider my duty done." I looked at the money, then at my daughter clutching my collar. A wave of humiliation and fury rose inside me. I was no longer the trembling girl in the kitchen on the day he left. Slowly, I picked up the cash, my hands shaking, then firmly pushed it back toward him. "We don't need your pity. I can manage on my own." Daniel paused for a moment, then let out a dry laugh, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't think holding your head high will make you succeed. You'll spend your whole life sewing in back rooms like this." He turned and walked away, the sound of his shoes echoing hollowly down the stairs. I stood still, holding my child, feeling my heart pound hard, painful, but also insistent, as if reminding me, "Remember this. Turn this humiliation into strength." That night, after putting Sophia to sleep, I sat at the old wooden table under the flickering yellow light. I opened my notebook, the one I used to fill with recipes, and began to write. My pen trembled across the paper, each word etched deep into my heart. I will rise, not for myself, for my daughter. Sophia will not grow up in poverty, will not be looked down upon. I swear I will do everything to make her proud to call me mother. When I put the pen down, a strange calmness filled me. Outside, the darkness was still thick, but inside that tiny room I had lit a new flame, the flame of determination. And I knew, no matter how thorny the road ahead, I would walk it for Sophia. The days that followed were still filled with hardship, but within that hardship, I began to notice faint glimmers of light. After my shifts at the tailor shop, I often brought home scraps of fabric. Sitting at the rickety wooden table, I stitched them into little dresses for Sophia. One day, the neighbor downstairs saw my daughter wearing a tiny floral dress I had made. She exclaimed, "Liz, did you make that for her yourself? It's adorable. I have an old dress, could you fix it for me?" I nodded, my heart trembling. From that one request, more small orders began to come. At first it was just a few dresses and shirts, then curtains, tablecloths. I didn't earn much, but every coin I received was a sign of recognition, proof that I could still stand on my own 2 feet. The people in the neighborhood began to know my name. Some playfully called me Liz the seamstress. It sounded small, perhaps, but to me it was a title full of pride. While I worked, Sophia often sat beside me. She made dolls from fabric scraps and whispered conversations to them. Sometimes I saw her hold up a piece of cloth, pretending it was a dress, and giggle. The sight filled me with both tenderness and sorrow. I knew she lacked many things compared to other children her age, but she never once complained. One afternoon, as the last light of day streamed through the window, I kept my head bent over the sewing machine. Sweat slid down my temple. My calloused hands pricked and bleeding from the needle. Sophia crawled over, placed a piece of pink fabric beside me, looked up with her wide, sparkling eyes, and suddenly blurted out in her tiny voice, "Mommy, you're my hero." I froze. That short, clumsy sentence pierced straight into my heart. My throat tightened, my vision blurred. I dropped the needle, pulled her into my arms, and wept uncontrollably. In those tears were the pain of betrayal, the years of loneliness, and the overwhelming joy of knowing that at least in one pair of eyes I was a hero. Not because I was strong, not because I was successful, but simply because I was her mother. I buried my face in Sophia's sun-scented hair and whispered, "Thank you, my love. You have no idea how much strength you just gave me." That night, I added a line to my journal. "Today, Sophia called me a hero." I will live worthy of that word for the rest of my life. After Sophia called me hero, it felt as if a new flame had been lit inside me. I sewed faster, produced more, and no longer feared sleepless nights. Perhaps fate wanted to test me further, because from those little mending jobs for neighbors, I suddenly received a special invitation. A regular customer came by and handed me a small slip of paper. "Liz, there's an amateur fashion show at the community hall this weekend. They're looking for more participants. I think you should give it a try." I froze. A fashion show? Me, a woman once abandoned by her husband, spending her days sewing in a cramped room? The thought was absurd and terrifying. But that night, as I watched Sophia sleep peacefully in my arms, I told myself, if my little girl sees me as a hero, why shouldn't I dare to try? I picked out a few dresses I had stitched together from scraps, altering every seam with care. On the day of the show, I walked into the community hall on trembling legs. The room held only a few dozen people, wooden chairs arranged in rows. No dazzling lights, no thousands of spectators, just a small stage. But to me, it felt as vast as the world. When the music began, I shook so hard I thought I might collapse. But then I remembered Sophia, remembered her innocent eyes when she called me hero. I took a deep breath, picked up the first dress, and stepped out. There was murmuring at first. I feared they were laughing, but then came applause, warm, rising applause. No one was mocking. They were encouraging. A woman shook her head with a smile. "Oh my, that dress is beautiful. Makes me want to wear it right now." Warmth spread through my chest. My throat tightened. After all the years of being belittled, all the times Daniel sneered that I'd never make anyone proud, here, in this little hall, for the first time, I felt I truly had worth. When the show ended, a middle-aged man approached me. His suit was worn, but his eyes shone brightly behind silver-rimmed glasses. He reached out his hand, his voice sincere. "You have talent. Don't waste it. The cuts, the details you create, this isn't the work of someone just sewing to get by. I see art in it." I stood still, my fingers pricked and sore from needles, trembling as they touched his hand. His words were, to me, like a passport opening a door I had never dared to cross. That night, back in our tiny apartment, I held Sophia close. I told her everything. She giggled as if she understood her mother's joy. And in that warm darkness, I whispered to myself, perhaps this is truly my first step. The small success of that amateur fashion show was like a seed planted in dry soil. I never imagined that just a few weeks later, a miracle would happen. A local journalist happened to hear about my story. She came to my little apartment, photographing me as I sat at my old sewing table while Sophia crawled around the scraps of fabric. They published an article with the headline, "Single Mother Turns Needle and Thread into a Fashion Dream." I still remember that morning, holding the newspaper in my hands, my picture printed in black and white on page 2. My heart pounded, part shame, part excitement. I never thought someone like me living in a cramped apartment, hands rough and calloused, would one day be the subject of an article. Then came the unexpected. More customers began to seek me out. A young woman asked me to make her a party dress. A shop owner requested a tailored coat. And someone even commissioned a ball gown for a dance. I could hardly believe it. Me, the woman who once starved to buy milk for her child, was now trusted to create dresses for the most dazzling occasions. At first, I was afraid I wasn't skilled enough, but every stitch, every fold of fabric I shaped carried love and care. I refused to work carelessly, because I knew this was not just a job, it was my one chance to prove to the world, and to myself, that I was worthy. Sophia, then only 4 years old, often played around my little workshop. She would use fabric scraps as blankets for her dolls, sometimes folding her hands solemnly as if watching a fashion show. I couldn't help but laugh, feeling lighter every time I saw her innocent joy. And then one day, I was invited to take part in a larger community fashion show, with a bigger audience and even professionals in attendance. I remember that moment vividly. The golden lights, the lively music, my dresses appearing one after another on stage. I stood backstage, heart racing, palms damp with sweat. Then, as one of the models stepped out in a blue evening gown, Sophia suddenly ran onto the stage. She threw her little arms around me, clinging tightly, her voice chirping, "Mommy, that's yours." Mommy did it. The whole hall fell silent for a few seconds, then erupted in laughter and thunderous applause. I held my daughter close, tears welling up, embarrassed yet overjoyed. In that moment, I was no longer just a seamstress, I was a mother, recognized by her own child. The applause wasn't just for the gown. It was for our journey from tears and hunger to the confident steps on that stage. I whispered into Sophia's ear, though the music nearly drowned me out, "Thank you, my love, for always believing I could." After that show, I felt reborn. The lights, the applause, Sophia's smile, they were like a fresh wind blowing through a life once shrouded in darkness. Yet even as my steps grew stronger, deep inside me the old wounds still lingered, throbbing like scars that hadn't healed. There were nights when, after folding the last pieces of fabric, I sat quietly watching Sophia sleep. Her eyelids lowered, lashes long and curled just like her father's. My heart ached. I had tried to bury Daniel in my memory, but the truth was, his shadow still flickered in our daughter. And I feared that one day, Sophia would blame me for letting her father go. Perhaps that was why I sought other places to pour out my soul. One afternoon, I came across a flyer about a charity fund for abandoned children. I knew I didn't have much to spare, yet I still decided to take part. Not only by giving a few coins, but with my own hands. I offered to sew clothes for the children, simple dresses, but clean and neat. Seeing their faces light up as they slipped into new clothes lifted a weight off my heart. In their eyes, I saw a piece of Sophia and also a piece of myself on the day Daniel walked away. Perhaps, by helping them, I was healing myself. That day, during a gathering of the foundation, I sat quietly at the back of the hall, mending a little shirt. Suddenly, a warm, deep voice sounded behind me. "Your stitches are so even." That's not easy to do. I looked up. Standing before me was a man in his 30s, tall, his face bearing traces of weariness. Yet his eyes were gentle. He reached out his hand and introduced himself. "I'm Richard Moore, a businessman who's been through a failed marriage." I hesitated. Why would he say that right away? Perhaps because he wanted me to know he understood what loss felt like. I set down the needle and softly replied, "I'm Liz, a single mother, who also knows the bitterness of brokenness." Richard's eyes met mine, surprised, but also as though he had found kinship. In that room full of cheerful chatter, among strangers, I suddenly felt not so alone. I had no idea that this chance encounter would open a new chapter in my life, a different door, wide and filled with challenges. After the meeting at the Charity Foundation, Richard didn't disappear like so many passing acquaintances. Sometimes he called just to ask how I was doing. Other times he stopped by with a bag of leftover fabric, saying it might come in handy. I realized this wasn't just politeness. He genuinely cared. Once, Richard stood for a while outside my little workshop. He wore a simple white shirt, carrying a leather briefcase. But his eyes weren't those of a businessman calculating profits. Instead, they held curiosity and admiration. "Liz," he said as he stepped inside, "I don't understand how you can work so much and still stay patient. These clothes, every stitch feels like it's telling a story." I blushed. I wasn't used to being praised. For most of my life, I had only heard criticism, scorn. I gave a small smile, kept sewing, and replied, "Maybe it's because I have no way back. I only have my daughter, and I must give her a future." Richard was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled up a wooden chair, sat beside me, and listened as I spoke about my dream. One day to have a small boutique with my name on it. A place where every woman, rich or poor, could find a dress that made her feel beautiful. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty advice. He just nodded, as if every word I spoke deserved respect. That way of listening eased something inside me. So different from Daniel, who only ever demanded I change to make him proud. Sophia, by then 6 years old, quickly grew fond of Richard. Each time he came, she would run to the door, calling out, "Uncle Richard, Uncle Richard." I laughed, a little embarrassed. "She insists on calling you that. I hope you don't mind." Richard waved it off with a gentle smile. "I love it. I never thought I'd hear a child call me that again." Once, Sophia handed him a little rag doll I had stitched. He accepted it, holding it with a kind of reverence, as though it were the most precious gift he'd ever received. Watching that scene, my heart softened. It was such a simple image, yet it filled me with a warmth I could hardly believe. I couldn't be sure what it was. I only knew that, for the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not with pity, but with admiration and respect. When Richard visited the workshop, our conversations weren't only about work or dresses. Sometimes we sat together for hours, sipping weak coffee, and he told me things he had never shared with anyone. He once had a marriage. His wife was beautiful, drawn to parties, praise, and the city lights. Richard, on the other hand, spent most of his time working. He wanted to build a solid foundation so his family could have a secure life. But the more he succeeded, the more he realized all he had left was a cold, empty house. "She left me, Liz," Richard said one time, his voice steady though his eyes dimmed. "She left for the glitter I couldn't give her. I thought, if I just worked harder, she'd come back. But in the end, it was nothing but an illusion." I stayed silent, feeling his pain mix with my own memories. We were alike in that way, both abandoned, both once wondering what we had done wrong. Despite his wounds, Richard was a straightforward man. Sometimes that honesty made him endearingly clumsy. When I confessed my worry about not having enough money to buy fabric for a new order, instead of comforting me, he immediately pulled out a notebook, broke down the costs, and suggested I raise my prices. I laughed, half weary, half relieved. "You always come with solutions. Sometimes I just need a hug." Richard scratched his head awkwardly, then admitted, "I'm sorry. Maybe I've never been good at comforting, but I want to help the only way I know how." It was that very clumsiness that made me trust him more. No pretenses, no sugar-coated lies, just a man trying to connect with whatever sincerity he had left after heartbreak. One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the workshop window, Richard stood quietly watching me work. I looked up and caught his gaze, uncertain, yet unwavering. He stepped closer and said softly, almost as if afraid to hear himself, "Liz, give me a chance to walk beside you." I froze, my hand still on the fabric. It wasn't a romantic declaration, no roses, no diamond ring, just a plain invitation. Yet my heart suddenly beat faster. Perhaps, after everything I'd been through, that simplicity was what I longed for most. When Richard asked to walk beside me, I hesitated for a long time. After all the wounds I had endured, it wasn't easy to believe I could still be happy. But Richard never pressed. He waited patiently. He came to the workshop, sitting quietly for hours just to help me sort fabric, listening as I spoke about my small dreams. That patience slowly eased the fear within me. One spring morning, we decided to hold a simple wedding. No extravagance, no glitter, just a few close friends and the warm faces who had accompanied me through the rough path. Sophia wore the white dress I had sewn with my own hands, clutching a tiny bouquet, excitedly running ahead as the flower girl. As I walked into that humble hall and saw Richard waiting with his gentle smile, my heart trembled in a very different way. Not the reckless pounding of youth, but the steady peace of someone who had weathered storms and finally found a safe harbor. Sophia ran to my side, whispering, "Mommy, you look like a princess." I laughed through tears. In that moment, I knew I wasn't just marrying a husband, I was giving my daughter the gift of a complete family. A few years later, I gave birth to Lucas, then Benjamin. The once quiet house now brimmed with the cries, the laughter, the pattering footsteps of children filling every hallway. I still remember the many nights Richard and I took turns carrying the babies, his clumsy hands fumbling but never once complaining. Instead, he would smile softly, kiss my forehead, and whisper, "I never thought I'd hear the sound of children again." Thank you, Liz. Those years, our home was always alive. Sophia grew older, becoming a caring big sister, often cradling Lucas or soothing Benjamin to sleep. Once, I caught her softly singing a lullaby to her brother, her face as tender as an angel's. My eyes welled as I thought, she deserves this happiness, after all the hardships. My work also flourished. The workshop, though small, was never short of orders. I sewed clothes for neighbors, for friends, and sometimes even crafted evening gowns, something I had once thought was only a dream. Each time I finished a new dress, I remembered those days in the damp little room, straining my eyes over old books. Now, all those efforts had begun to bear fruit. But above all, what I cherished most wasn't money or recognition, but the peace within our home. Each evening, we gathered around the dinner table, Sophia chattering about school, Lucas babbling, Benjamin laughing uncontrollably. Richard would often glance around, squeeze my hand beneath the table, and whisper, "This is my dream come true." And I, a woman who once thought she had lost everything, had found a simple, whole happiness again. A new family, where love had been pieced together from fragments. In the years after the wedding, my life turned a new page. I was no longer just Liz, the seamstress from the small neighborhood. The articles, the community fashion shows had opened doors. My name began appearing in local magazines. Orders started coming from other towns. They wrote of Elizabeth Moore, the single mother who turned needle and thread into hope. I would sit in my workshop, listening to the steady hum of the sewing machine, the scent of new fabric floating in the air, my heart swelling with gratitude. Sometimes, I could hardly believe that these same hands, once bleeding from needles, had built a brand. Even if it was only the first steps, Richard always supported me. But I knew deep down he still carried a quiet fear, a fear that this fragile happiness could vanish, that the painful past we both endured might repeat itself. Sometimes, at family dinners, I caught his eyes on me, half gentle, half anxious. Once, I asked him, "What are you afraid of, Richard?" He hesitated, then sighed. "I once lost a family, Liz. I can't let that happen again. Sometimes I'm afraid I'm not good enough to keep you and the children." I took his hand, squeezing it tight. "We've been through enough loss already. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you here, with me, raising our children." His gaze softened, then brightened. In that moment, I saw clearly. It was his fear that made him treasure me, treasure this family. And sometimes his clumsiness was its own reminder that we couldn't take this happiness for granted. At dinner after that, Richard would often tell the children stories of his own childhood, teach Sophia how to plant seeds in the garden, build little wooden houses with Lucas and Benjamin. Our home was always full of laughter, as if trying to make up for all the lonely days we had both endured. Now, sitting at 65 and looking back, I still smile. Back then, I thought I had weathered every storm, that this happiness would last forever. I believed I had finally reached the harbor, and in the voice of my present self, I whisper, I thought the storms were over. There were days when I truly believed the past had fallen asleep for good. My life was full orders to complete, school runs with the children, dinners filled with chatter and laughter. I never thought of Daniel anymore. To me, he was a locked door, sealed shut. But fate, cruel as ever, chooses the most ordinary moments to remind us that old wounds never truly disappear. That day, I took the children to the supermarket. Sophia, 11 now, and nearly up to my shoulder, had begun paying attention to dresses. Lucas, 5, skipped along pushing a small cart. Benjamin, only 3, sat in the basket giggling each time I handed him an apple. I was lost in the sight of them and didn't notice, until a familiar, mocking voice rose behind me. Well, look at that. Still just a housewife in cheap clothes. I froze. That sound, that tone, I could have recognized it among a million voices. I turned, and there was Daniel. He hadn't changed much. Still that overblown confidence, still the smirk that chilled me. Only now, a designer coat hung carelessly over his arm, and beside him stood Angela, the mistress of years ago, now his lawful wife. Angela seemed to revel in the moment. She swung her expensive leather bag, her eyes sweeping over me with contempt from head to toe. I told you, Daniel, some people are born to do manual labor. They can try their whole lives, but they'll always be ordinary. I bit my lip hard. For an instant, old memories surged back. The sound of the suitcase dragging away, Sophia's wailing in her crib, the wedding photo shattering on the floor. The sting of that pain cut deep, but unlike 9 years ago, I did not collapse. I stood tall, resting a hand gently on Sophia's shoulder. She looked up at me, eyes wide with curiosity, not yet understanding what was happening. I knew one wrong word here, and Daniel and Angela would plant wounds in her heart that might never heal. I drew in a long breath, forcing my voice to stay calm. Let's go, Sophia, Daniel chuckled, stepping forward as if to reassert some old power. Still the same, always running away. You'll never escape my shadow. I didn't answer. Instead, I took Sophia's hand and pushed the cart toward the checkout. But inside, I whispered to myself, "You're wrong, Daniel. I left your shadow long ago. The proof stands right here, my children, my new family. They are the life you could never destroy." I didn't answer Daniel, not because I was afraid, but because I knew any word I spoke in that moment would only feed his satisfaction. I tightened my grip on Sophia's hand, pushed the cart forward, and headed toward the checkout. With every step, I heard the pounding of my own heartbeat, loud and urgent, as if trying to drown out the smirk behind me. I could feel Sophia glance back, her young eyes still clouded with confusion. She was no longer the little girl who clung to my leg whenever she cried. Now, she was old enough to sense that something about this brief encounter was not ordinary. We reached the parking lot. I strapped Benjamin into his seat, while Lucas chattered excitedly about spotting a giant cookie display in the store. But Sophia stayed silent, her eyes lowered, her small hand still resting in mine, as if waiting for an answer. Finally, she looked up, her voice soft but clear. "Mommy, was that my father?" The question struck like a fist to my chest. I froze, my hand trembling as it held hers. I had prepared myself for so many challenges in life, ruined orders, sleepless nights, even the sharp tongues of others. But I had never been ready for this question. I looked into her eyes so hauntingly like Daniel's. In an instant, memories surged back. The crib rocking, the cries tearing through me. The back of a man walking away without a glance. I wanted to scream the truth, to tell her everything so she would understand the pain I had endured. But then I saw that innocent face, heard Lucas and Benjamin laughing behind us, and I knew today was not the day. I bent down, brushing my hand gently against her cheek. My voice was so quiet it felt meant for her alone. "Don't mind it." Sophia frowned slightly, her lips parting as if to ask more. But then she stopped. She nodded, obediently climbing into the car. I watched her, my heart heavy. I knew the day would come, the day I'd have to face the truth with her. But today, all I could do was protect her smile a little longer, preserve Sophia's childhood peace for as long as I could. In that moment, I whispered to myself, "One day, my love, I will tell you everything, but not today." Just 2 days after that bitter encounter at the supermarket, I saw a name I thought I had left behind. That evening, Richard was in his small home office. He had a habit of checking emails after dinner, reading and jotting notes into his thick notebook. I carried in a cup of hot tea, set it gently on the desk, and my eyes accidentally skimmed across the computer screen. There it was, standing out among dozens of work emails, a name that made my breath catch. Daniel Carter. I froze. It felt as though the blood in my veins had turned to ice. In that instant, every mocking word from the supermarket, cheaply dressed housewife, "You'll never escape my shadow," came roaring back in my head. My chest tightened, sharp pain twisting through an old wound that had never fully healed. Richard looked up and saw my pale face, his brow furrowed. "Liz, what's wrong?" I swallowed hard, my hand trembling as I pointed to the screen. "That email, it's from Daniel." Richard blinked in surprise, then skimmed through the message. The email was written in polished, courteous language, Daniel inviting him to a grand dinner to discuss a multi-million-dollar business deal. The words were carefully chosen, the promises glittering. I recognized it instantly. That was Daniel's way. He had always known how to wrap himself in elegance and sophistication. But inside was nothing but cold calculation. My heart raced wildly. I couldn't stop remembering Angela's smug look, her flaunted designer bag, and Daniel's scornful voice echoing in the crowded supermarket. That had been less than 48 hours ago. And now here he was again, this time appearing at my doorstep through my husband's work. I staggered back a step, clutching my chest. "Richard, I don't want to see him. I don't want to." He placed a steady hand on my shoulder, firm yet gentle. His eyes held no pity, only quiet resolve. "I understand, but listen to me, Liz. Daniel has no power over you anymore. He's just trying to use business as an excuse. If you don't want this, I'll make sure he never gets the chance to stand above you." I looked into Richard's eyes. There was no doubt in them, no hesitation, only determination to protect. But still, my heart ached, because the truth was, even after rebuilding my life from ashes, just hearing Daniel's name was enough to make me feel small, fragile, like the woman I had been on the day he walked away. I turned toward the living room, where Sophia, Lucas, and Benjamin were laughing together, their voices ringing bright. And I thought to myself, no, I cannot let Daniel return and disrupt this life. I cannot let my children witness their mother's old wounds reopen. I sat down on the chair beside the desk, my hands clasped so tightly together it felt as if letting go would make everything shatter. For years, I had buried most of my pain about Daniel deep inside, revealing only fragments to Richard. I was afraid that if I told him everything, he would look at me with that gaze I hated most, the gaze of pity. But when that email appeared, when that name knocked on the door of my life again, I knew I couldn't keep it hidden any longer. I drew a deep breath, and I began to speak. I told him about that afternoon when I was 29, Daniel standing in the kitchen, suitcase in hand, walking away while Sophia's cries pierced the air. I told him about the hungry nights when I gave up my only meal to buy milk for my daughter. I told him about the time he returned, throwing a wad of cash onto the table as if tossing scraps to a beggar. And I told him about our encounter in the supermarket just 2 days ago, the mocking words, the sneering eyes, the humiliation I thought I had overcome but still lived within me. My voice trembled. My eyes blurred. When I finished, the room was filled only with the ticking of the clock on the wall. I didn't dare lift my head, my heart pounding wildly, waiting for Richard's reaction. He didn't speak at once. Instead, Richard stood, walked over, and gently pulled me into his arms. His embrace was warm, steady, so different from the coldness I had endured before. He whispered into my ear, his voice deep and resolute. Liz, you've carried too much for too long. But listen to me. From now on, you won't face him alone. I will never let Daniel raise his head before you, not even once. Tears poured down my face, soaking his shoulder. But this time, they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of release. For the first time, I felt I wasn't alone. Richard released me, then looked straight into my eyes. In his gaze, I saw an unshakable resolve. He smiled, a quiet, confident smile, not dramatic, but the expression of a man who knew he now held the advantage. That dinner, he said slowly, will be nothing like what he expects. My heart pounded. For the first time, I no longer felt fear when Daniel's name was spoken, because now, at my side, stood a man ready to protect me, not for pride, but for the love he bore for me and for our children. That night, after the children had gone to bed, the house sank into silence. Only the warm glow from the living room lamp cast our shadows onto the wall. I thought Richard might forget about the email, or simply send a polite refusal. But no, he sat across from me, eyes serious, fingers tapping lightly on the wooden table. Liz, he began. I'm not planning to just turn down Daniel's invitation. I startled, tightening my grip on the teacup. What do you mean? Richard leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Not just refuse. We need to make him lose face. Everyone must see him for who he really is. I won't let him stand tall in front of you, in front of us. My heart pounded. Part of me felt a wave of relief, like someone was finally ready to claim justice for me. But another part trembled with fear. I set the cup down, my voice pleading. You don't have to do this for me. I've grown used to being belittled by him. I just want this to end. I don't want you dragged into my old wounds. Richard was quiet for a moment, then placed his warm hand over mine. He shook his head, his voice firm. I'm not doing this just for you, Liz. I'm doing it for our family and for justice. Daniel didn't just hurt you. He insulted everything we have. I can't stand by. I looked into his eyes and saw an unwavering resolve. Richard had never been one to boast, but I knew once he made up his mind, it carried all of his heart and strength. I sighed, a storm of gratitude, fear, and hope rising inside me. For years, I had lived by enduring, by swallowing tears in silence just to survive. But Richard was different. He didn't want us to merely survive, he wanted us to stand tall. I wondered, was it time to stop fearing the past? To stop letting Daniel torment me any longer? Richard squeezed my hand tighter, his gaze steady, as if promising something greater. And I knew, from that night on, a new plan had begun, not just to end things, but to expose the truth. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our home was both calm and tense. Richard spoke discreetly with a few trusted partners, and I understood he didn't intend to refuse Daniel in an ordinary way. I worried, even feared, but then Richard placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled. Liz, this isn't just your battle. This is a chance for the whole world to see you're no longer the woman who once cried in a tiny kitchen. You're different now. For the first time in my life, I allowed someone to tend to my appearance. Richard called a stylist he trusted, a young woman with bright eyes and skilled hands. She brought dresses I had never imagined touching. Shimmering silks, elegant cuts, rich colors. I hesitated when trying on a deep sapphire evening gown. its open back cut just enough to suggest pride without excess. I stood before the mirror, almost unable to recognize myself. The stylist smiled, clipped on a pair of delicate earrings, then stepped back and whispered, "Mrs. Liz, you're not just a designer, you're a true lady." I blushed, caught between embarrassment and the strange warmth of newfound confidence. I had grown so used to simple clothes, fingers pricked with thread, hair tied hastily out of the way. But now, in the mirror, I saw a woman who stood tall, a woman with strength in her reflection. While I prepared, Richard was busy in his own way. He sent invitations to several key partners, the very people Daniel was desperate to win over. But instead of letting Daniel control the stage, Richard moved first, arranging for them to accompany us to Daniel's own party. That evening, as the golden light settled over the house, I tried on the gown one last time. Sophia stood at the doorway, her eyes wide with amazement. "Mommy, you look like a movie star." I laughed, pulling her into an embrace. But inside me another feeling surged. No longer shame, no longer fear of comparison. This time it was pride. I turned back to the mirror. The woman staring back at me had eyes that burned bright, no longer timid or afraid. In them lived an entire journey, rising from ashes, standing again, and now ready to face whatever came. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought, Daniel will never again see me fall. This time, he will see someone different, completely different, and in the voice of my present self. I smile. Those eyes no longer belong to the woman I once was. The night of the party came sooner than I expected. The luxury hotel in the heart of the city blazed with lights. Outside, sleek cars lined up, and gentlemen and ladies in dazzling evening attire walked the red carpet. Sitting in the car, I watched it all, my heart racing wildly. For a moment, I wondered, me, a woman who once lived in a damp little apartment, who starved herself to buy milk for her child, am I really stepping into this place? Richard squeezed my hand firmly, whispering, "Liz, remember you deserve to be here. No one can deny that." The car door opened. The air of festivity rushed in, perfume mingling with laughter, and the clink of crystal glasses. At the center of the grand hall stood Daniel and Angela, greeting guests. They wore their familiar fouet of glamour. Daniel in a polished black tuxedo, Angela radiant in a fiery red gown with diamonds glittering at her neck. Both smiled their rehearsed smiles, shaking hands as though they ruled the world. I stepped out of the car, drawing a deep breath. The moment Richard and I entered through the grand doors, the chandelier's light cascaded down, and the room seemed to pause for a beat. Richard walked with confidence, his hand steady around mine. I no longer felt like Liz the seamstress of old. I felt like a proud lady, walking beside the man who was truly mine. Whispers began to ripple through the hall. Eyes turned toward me. Someone tilted their head and murmured, "Who is she? She looks so elegant." Another answered, "That's Elizabeth Moore. She's making waves in the local fashion scene." I heard she started from nothing. Hearing those words, an indescribable emotion rose within me. Every glance, every approving nod was living proof that I had finally stepped beyond the past. Angela stiffened when her eyes landed on me. Her carefully painted smile faltered for a few seconds. Daniel stood frozen, his hand trembling around his glass of wine. The sight pulled me back to the years of humiliation under their shadow, but this time, the roles had reversed. Compliments rang out from different corners. "Mrs. Moore is so graceful. Look, she carries herself like a true lady of success." I lifted my head, letting the light fall across my face. In that moment, I felt the stark difference. No more pitying looks, no more mocking laughter. I was being seen for who I truly was, a strong woman who had risen from the ruins. Richard leaned close, his voice low with pride. "See, this is the real you." And I smiled, letting my heart beat to a new rhythm, the rhythm of recognition, of the quiet victory I had waited for all these years. I could feel every gaze upon me, like beams of light piercing through the shell of my past. But the ones that mattered most were the eyes fixed on me from the entrance. Daniel and Angela. Daniel was struck dumb. The wine glass in his hand shook violently, a few drops spilling over onto his shoes, yet he didn't even notice. The once arrogant face, the one that had sneered at me in the supermarket, now twisted with shock. He stared at me as though he couldn't believe that the woman standing tall in a dazzling evening gown was the same young wife who once wept in a cramped kitchen. Angela, by his side, was just as stunned, her lips pressed tight, her eyes blazing with bitterness. I could see the jealousy etched deep into her gaze. For years, she had basked in glitter and believed she had won, that I was nothing but a faded shadow left behind. But in this moment, it all crumbled. The truth was undeniable. I was still here, head held high, receiving admiration from all around. And she was only a glittering ornament at Daniel's side. The atmosphere in the hall shifted. Some guests who had long known Daniel whispered to each other, smirks tugging at their lips as though watching a farce. Others moved toward Richard, shaking his hand, praising our entrance. I caught fragments of murmurs. Unbelievable. She's the one who's made Daniel bow his head. Another chuckled softly. Life is ironic indeed. The man who abandoned her is now forced to look up at her. I didn't need to join in their whispers. Just standing there, smiling, was enough. What I felt wasn't gloating, it was peace. After all these years, I no longer needed to prove anything to Daniel. My presence tonight was proof enough. I glanced at him one last time. He forced a strained smile, but his trembling hand betrayed him. His eyes were frantic, bewildered, and I knew never before had he felt so small around us. The guests chuckled under their breath, nodding, exchanging amused glances that rippled through the crowd like waves. In that moment, I heard the quiet verdict of the room: no one admired Daniel anymore. The image of the victor he once wore was nothing but a cracked shell. And I, in the voice of my present self, smiled softly. That night, I didn't need to do a thing. Daniel's shock became the performance for the entire hall. The atmosphere of the party had already been electric since the moment Richard and I stepped in. But the true climax came when the microphone echoed through the hall, and the host invited Richard to speak. Richard walked onto the stage. Applause rippled through the room, and I watched him stride forward beneath the golden lights. My heart pounded, my hand tightening around my glass. I whispered, trying to steady my voice, "Richard, what are you going to say?" He turned back to me with a calm smile. "The things you deserve to hear." Taking the microphone, he stood tall in the center of the hall. Conversations hushed. A few guests leaned forward, expecting to hear about multi-million-dollar projects. But Richard began with a sentence that froze the entire room. "Tonight, I don't want to speak about numbers or contracts. I want to speak about a person, the one who has become my whole world." Every gaze turned toward me. My head swam, my cheeks flushed. Richard continued, his voice steady and clear. "When I met Liz, she had nothing but calloused hands and a heart full of determination. She once went hungry just to buy milk for her child. She worked through endless nights at a rickety table, clinging to the smallest spark of hope. If you want to know what resilience looks like, look at her." Whispers stirred across the hall. A lady in the front row murmured to her husband, "How moving. I never knew Mrs. Moore had such a past." Richard smiled, bowing his head slightly toward me. "Liz is not only my wife. She is the soul of my family. She has taught me and our children the most valuable lesson. True strength is not in what we own, but in how we rise after we fall." Applause erupted, thunderous and unrelenting, forcing Richard to pause. My eyes blurred with tears. My hands trembled. Sophia, sitting in the audience, beamed at me, her lips mouthing, "Mommy, you're my hero." Richard raised his hand to quiet the room, then spoke again, his tone firm yet tender. "Once, someone told her, 'You'll never make me proud.' But tonight, before all of you, I want to say, Liz, You have made me prouder than anything else in my life." The hall exploded in ovation. Some guests even stood, clapping with genuine admiration. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, caught between embarrassment and overwhelming joy. Meanwhile, Daniel's unease was impossible to hide. He pushed through the crowd, tugged sharply at Richard's sleeve just as he stepped down from the podium, and hissed through clenched teeth, "Enough. People came here to hear about business, not your family stories. Now, sign the contract, we have matters to settle." I stood nearby, clearly seeing the beads of sweat on Daniel's forehead. For the first time, I witnessed him unsettled, a man once so arrogant and self-assured, now shaken by a speech that had nothing to do with contracts. Richard remained calm. He gently removed Daniel's hand from his sleeve, his eyes cool yet courteous. "We'll talk about the contract later." The hall erupted again in thunderous applause, as if to declare, tonight did not belong to Daniel. The ovation rolled on, wave after wave crashing against the proud walls Daniel had built for himself. I saw him grimace, forcing a stiff smile, his knuckles whitening as he clutched his glass. He leaned closer to Richard, his voice low but sharp enough for me and a few others nearby to hear. "You think that was noble? Don't be naive. You pity her, that's all. This woman, I left her, and she'll always be a failure." The words might once have cut me to pieces, but this time, I didn't tremble. I stood tall, lifting my chin, meeting Daniel's eyes directly. He no longer saw a young wife weeping in a tiny kitchen. He saw a woman who would never be trampled again. Angela stepped forward, her face taut, her fingers clutching Daniel's arm. Her voice, tight with frustration, hissed, "You promised me this would be a perfect night. You promised everyone would look at us with admiration. But look, they're all looking at her." Daniel jerked his arm free, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He turned back to Richard, scrambling for leverage, his tone suddenly bargaining. "Fine. Let's forget this. Just sign the contract now, so everyone sees we're still partners. This is a big opportunity, you don't want to miss it." Richard didn't flare up. He simply adjusted his collar, fixing Daniel with a steady, unyielding gaze. His voice rang out, crisp and loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "I don't do business with a man who disrespects his own family." The hall fell silent for a beat, then rippled with murmurs. A few guests exchanged glances, nodding. Whispers rose. "Mr. Moore is right. A man who scorns his own family, how could he ever be trusted in business?" Daniel froze, speechless. Richard's clean, decisive words landed like a final blow, striking down his arrogance before everyone. I saw it clearly. The admiration Daniel once commanded now turning away, cold and distant. I drew a deep breath and clasped Richard's hand. In that moment, I knew this was not just my victory, it was our family's. With just one sentence from Richard, the entire room began to shift. At first, it was only a few skeptical glances. Then came the nods. Then, like sparks catching dry straw, whispers ignited across the hall. "Didn't he abandon his wife and child?" Someone murmured, "Yes, I've heard that. So it's true. My God. And he stands here preaching morals." The murmurs started in small clusters but spread like wind. In less than 10 minutes, the ballroom was flooded with half-true, half-embroidered stories. Daniel had abandoned his wife after she gave birth. Daniel was cold, calculating, driven only by money. Daniel was no ideal man, just a braggart wearing a mask. I stood still, watching. No one needed to expose him. No one needed to accuse him. The truth found its own way out. The same guests who had greeted him with polite smiles now began to withdraw, their faces tightening. A few quietly set down their glasses and slipped away. I caught sight of Daniel trying to stand upright, his fist clenching tight. His face turned pale, then flushed red, then pale again. Angela, beside him, muttered something in agitation, but Daniel only shook his head, the swagger gone from his frame. More and more guests left before the main course was even served. The clack of hurried heels on marble, the scrape of chairs, each sound slicing into Daniel's pride. The hall that had been so lively now shimmered with empty spaces, leaving him stranded under the cold crystal lights. I looked at Daniel for a long moment. Years ago, I had dreamed of seeing him fall, humiliated before everyone, so I could feel the satisfaction of revenge. But as it unfolded, my heart felt no joy. There is no real victory in watching the father of your child unmasked. There is no happiness in seeing someone who once shared your home now stand alone, disgraced. All I felt was emptiness, like watching a dying fragment of my painful past, writhing in its last breath before me. I drew in a deep breath, took Richard's hand, and whispered to myself, "This is enough. I don't need to gloat. I just need to move on." Amid the heavy silence of the hall, a memory surged back. I was back on that night, the first night after Daniel left. I was sitting in a cheap rented room with peeling walls and a window creaking under the wind. In my arms, Sophia, just a year old, cried herself hoarse. I held her, rocking in despair, my tears mingling with sweat. Back then, I thought my life had ended. But now, standing under these glittering lights, watching Daniel tremble under turned away gazes, I knew all that pain had not been for nothing. It had forged me into the woman I am today, and that is something he will never have. Angela turned to Daniel, her eyes cold, her voice full of bitterness. "You promised me it would be different. You promised that with you, I would never be humiliated. But look, they're all leaving. No one believes in you anymore." Daniel bit down hard on his lip, veins bulging at his temple. His eyes swept across the room, searching desperately for a nod, a hand extended in support. But none came. Those who once flattered him now lowered their gazes, quietly slipping away, leaving behind a vast emptiness of isolation, unable to bear it. Daniel suddenly slammed his fist against the banquet table. Crystal shattered with a sharp crash, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. But instead of drawing sympathy, the outburst only hastened the retreat. A few guests shook their heads in disapproval. Others sighed and averted their eyes. I stood in the corner of the room, watching it all with an uncanny calm. After so many years, it wasn't me, it was Daniel himself who tore away his mask. What remained was only a solitary man, raging in a hall already abandoned by everyone. And in the voice of my present self, I whispered, "Sometimes, justice needs no judge. It arrives in the simple act of truth revealed." I thought that after that night at the banquet, everything would finally end. Daniel had lost face, been abandoned by colleagues, unmasked before so many. But I was wrong. A man who had lived by deceit doesn't surrender so easily. Just days later, rumors began to spread. At first, I only caught whispers through an old friend. "Liz, have you heard? Daniel's saying you made it all up, that you just exploited Richard's pity to change your life." I laughed bitterly, thinking it was only the last flailing of a man already defeated. But the rumors didn't stop. Daniel told others I had been a burden, that I was just a discarded woman clinging to a wealthy man to climb higher. His filthy words slipped quickly into society, and before long, they reached Sophia. At 12, caught in that fragile age, she began hearing the whispers at school. One afternoon, she came home with red-rimmed eyes. She tried to hide it, but I knew. That night, I heard her door slam, followed by muffled sobs. When I knocked, her voice burst out shaking, angry. "Mom, why didn't you tell me everything? My friends said you were abandoned. That Dad left because you weren't good enough. Is that true?" I froze. Every word was a knife twisting into me. I wanted to rush in, hold her tight, tell her it was all lies. But I knew this moment required neither comfort nor falsehood. She needed the truth. Leaning against the doorframe, tears burning my eyes, I let the silence weigh heavy. Then I pushed the door open. Sophia sat on the bed, clutching a pillow, her eyes swollen from crying. The sight crushed my heart. I moved closer, sat beside her, and placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. Sophia. My voice quivered. I'm sorry for hiding it, but you deserve to know the truth. She lifted her gaze, her eyes shining in the dim light, waiting. I inhaled deeply and told her everything. The night Daniel left, the crib rocking in that shabby rented room, the nights I starved so I could buy milk for her. I held nothing back, softened nothing, because more than anyone, Sophia had the right to know where she came from. When I finished, silence filled the room. Sophia lowered her head, tears rolling down her cheeks. I feared she would resent me, feel ashamed of her father. But then, the unexpected happened. She wiped her eyes, sat up straight, and looked at me with a steadiness that stole my breath. Her voice was hoarse from crying, but firm. Mom, you're stronger than anyone I know. I was stunned. Tears spilled from me again, but this time from joy. I pulled her into my arms, my heart trembling. In that moment, I knew Daniel could spread every rumor, could smear my name all he wanted, but one truth remained untouchable. I had raised my daughter with nothing but grit and love. The next morning, Sophia went to school with swollen eyes but her back straight. When someone whispered behind her, she simply smiled and said, "My mom is stronger than anyone I know." That phrase spread like wildfire, and for the first time, I saw Sophia no longer just as a child needing protection. She had become my pillar. As for Daniel, the rumors he invented did nothing to save him. Instead of breaking me, they only deepened everyone's contempt for him. And then, one evening, when everything had spun far beyond his control, Angela fixed her icy gaze on him. Her voice was cold, cutting, and final. Maybe the fault was never hers, but yours. Some storms leave ruin behind, but others come only to remind us how strong our roof truly is. When the rumors faded, when Daniel no longer had the power to wound me again, I realized a truth. Forgiveness is the truest strength. Not forgiveness for Daniel, he never deserved it, but forgiveness for myself. Forgiving the 29-year-old woman who collapsed, who thought her life had ended. Forgiving the years I blamed myself for not keeping my first family together, because only by forgiving myself could I truly be free. One afternoon, I sat on the wooden chair in the garden. Lucas and Benjamin chased each other between the flower beds, their laughter ringing bright across the yard. Sophia sat on the porch, a book in her lap but her gaze lifted, following her brothers with a gentle smile. She had grown, yet still kept her innocence and now carried a confidence I had once feared she might lack. I closed my eyes, breathing in the lavender carried by the breeze, letting the peace seep into my skin. Those sounds, the children's laughter, the rustling leaves, were the music I had longed for in the darkest nights of my life. Richard stepped out from the porch, carrying a cup of hot tea. He sat beside me, his warm hand resting over mine. In the glow of the setting sun, he looked at me and said, his voice low but certain, "Liz, we won by staying together." I lifted my eyes to him, my heart brimming with a feeling beyond words. Not loud pride, but quiet fulfillment. Yes, we had won. Not because anyone praised us, not because an enemy was forced to kneel. We had won simply because, after everything, this family still sat together, still held hands, still walked forward as one. I smiled, squeezed his hand, and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." Richard said nothing, only pressed a gentle kiss onto my hand, and that was enough. That evening, the whole family gathered around the dinner table. The meal was nothing extravagant, just Richard's favorite stew, a salad prepared by Sophia, and the two little ones giggling as they fought over the last piece of bread. But in that moment, I realized I was living in the greatest luxury of all, peace. Laughter filled the house, echoing into every corner, washing away the last traces of poisonous rumors outside. I looked around the table, Sophia with her proud eyes, Lucas and Benjamin with their innocent smiles, Richard with his steady gaze of trust. Quietly, my heart whispered, "This is the real victory." When the children ran upstairs to prepare for bed, I lingered at the table. Watching the candle flicker, my mind drifted back over everything. The broken marriage, the cold rented room, Daniel's mocking laughter, the tears no one ever saw. All those moments once convinced me my life had ended. But now, I held a clearer answer than ever before. I turned, looking directly at the audience as if those listening to my story were sitting right across from me at this very table. My voice was slow, steady. I didn't win against Daniel. I won by keeping my family. As the words left me, a lightness spread through my chest. For years, I had mistaken justice for the sight of a betrayer brought low. But now I knew. Justice was seeing the ones I loved still smiling, still growing, safe in my arms. The next morning, as I brewed coffee, an envelope arrived. Inside was a carefully written letter, in the neat but youthful script of a recent graduate. "Dear Ms. Liz, I grew up hearing your story. I dream of learning from you one day, from the woman who turned pain into strength. Would you consider being my mentor?" I smiled softly. Out there, a new generation was waiting for me, not just to pass on stitches and seams, but to share experience and resilience in the golden light of dawn. I knew a new chapter was beginning, no longer bound to pain, but built on sharing. I am 65 now. Some afternoons, sitting alone by the window, I listen to the wind rustling through the trees and let my memories drift back over the years. People often say old age brings forgetfulness, but for me, it brings clarity. The old scars no longer bleed, but they tell their own story, the story of how a woman learned to rise from ruins. Slowly, I whisper, as if confiding to myself or to anyone listening across the river of time. Life takes a way to teach us how to stand up again. It never gives easily, but it doesn't steal everything either. If we're patient enough, what remains is the strength we never thought we had. From the back of the house comes the sound of lively chatter. My family is preparing for our annual photo shoot, a small tradition Richard suggested many years ago. I glance through the window and see Sophia arranging her brother's positions. Sophia is now a grown woman, graceful in stature, her eyes steady but still holding that same tenderness. She places her hand gently on Lucas and Benjamin's shoulders like a proud sister. I smile. My daughter once cried in a dark little room, asking me in despair, "Mom, why didn't you tell me everything?" Now she has become a woman who knows how to protect herself and her family. Lucas has grown into a thoughtful young man, while Benjamin still keeps the humor that makes everyone laugh. Richard, his hair now touched with silver, still stands there, a steady shoulder I have leaned on for decades. When the whole family gathers before the lens, I step into the garden, the soft afternoon sunlight spilling over us. The photographer urges, "All right, everyone look here." Big smiles, and in that moment, I feel fully the prize I reclaimed after all the storms. A family portrait not perfect, but filled with love. Softly, in my present voice, I murmur, "This is my legacy. Not wealth, not fame, but a family that knows love and feels proud to call me mother." When the photographer signals the shoot is over, we all burst into laughter because Benjamin kept making silly faces in the last shot. I step back, watching the scene, Sophia's hair glowing in the sunlight, Lucas with his arm around his brother, laughter ringing bright through the garden. My heart floods with a peace words cannot capture. Richard comes to stand beside me. He wraps his arms around me from behind, holding me close as if to remind me that I am still here, within the embrace of the man who has walked with me all these years. His hair may be grayer, but his shoulders are as strong as the day I first leaned on them. I rest my head on his chest and whisper, "We've come so far, haven't we?" Richard smiles, kissing my hair softly. "Yes, Liz, late, but whole, and I wouldn't trade it for anything." I close my eyes, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat mingling with the laughter of our children behind us. Perhaps this is the moment I longed for in my youth, but only truly found when I had lived enough to treasure it. I turn, looking straight at the audience as if you were sitting across from me, listening to the journey of a lifetime. My voice deepens, slow and steady. If it were you, would you choose to be drowned by the past, or turn it into wings to fly further? The question doesn't need an immediate answer. It only needs to linger, so that each person can discover their own response in the course of their life. The light softens. My family's image fades gently in the golden dusk, leaving behind the wide-open window framing the sky. Then the screen goes dark, and only the echoes remain, the pure laughter of children, an immortal sound rising above every ruin, reminding us that love is the only true legacy. My dear friends, if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to leave a comment and share your thoughts or your own experiences. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue to listen, to tell, and to live through stories together, stories that may be yours, or perhaps someone you once knew.